This lecture is about the Atlantic trade system, otherwise known as the slave trade, which means that while it will be quite interesting, it will also be horrifying. American slavery really began in the Chesapeake, where tobacco plantations required huge amounts of labor. Remember, originally these plantations used indentured servants, but with so many other colonies available as alternative places to move, and because there were fewer population problems in England, not as many people were willing to sign contracts that would force them into the fields for a number of years. But that still doesn't explain why Africans became the ideal slave population. Well, one reason was religion. Both Christianity and Islam allowed for the enslavement of heathens, which conveniently means anyone who doesn't believe the same thing that you believe. This went double for anyone of exotic origin, which meant, anyone that doesn't look like you or isn't from the same place as you're from. In fact, some Christians argued that by enslaving humans, they could encourage those people to convert to Christianity. Of course, they're only trying to help. Now, African slavery was a result of these warped worldviews, as well as the fact that European explorers to Africa could trade manufactured goods to African merchants in exchange for slaves that had been captured by other Africans. This became the custom as the Atlantic trade system became more and more profitable. Most of the enslaved people taken to America were from West Africa. The Ivory, Gold, and Slave Coasts, as well as Angola, all had trading posts that provided slaves to European merchants. African rulers of these coastal regions controlled the flow of European goods to the interior of the continent, which made them very rich, which in turn encouraged them to continue trading with Europeans. The Atlantic slave trade is often dubbed the Triangle Trade, but that doesn't speak to the complexity of the system. At its core, slaves were traded mostly from Africa to the Caribbean, where they were used to harvest sugar, which would then be refined into molasses. The Caribbean would then ship sugar, molasses, and slaves to North America, where the molasses would be turned into rum, and slaves could be used to work the plantations there. The products of American plantations, such as rice, tobacco, indigo, wheat, and other things, were shipped to Europe in exchange for manufactured goods made in factories there. Europe would also ship manufactured goods to Africa, where they could be traded for slaves that would go to European colonies in America, and the cycle would continue. There were other trade routes. Rum from North America was sent to Africa in exchange for slaves, and New England lumber was sent to Europe in order to make shipmasts. But the key to the entire system was the slave trade. The single most horrifying aspect of the Atlantic trade system were the slave voyages, known as the Middle Passage. Men were shackled in pairs and often confined to a small space below deck, except for periods of exercise, where they would be brought topside to run around and stay fit. Women and children had a better chance of being allowed to move around while on board, and would often prepare meals and clean. Many slaves refused to eat, jumped overboard, or revolted in protest. The conditions were simply hellish. Between 10 and 20% of the slaves traveling the Middle Passage died en route. Slaves were transported to every part of British North America. In the Chesapeake, African slaves were used to cultivate tobacco plantations. Only wealthy landowners could afford bondspeople, whose labor made them even more wealthy. As a result, slave owners quickly became the members of an emerging upper class, while an income gap appeared between them and those without slaves or indentured servants. In the Carolinas, slaves who were skilled at cultivating rice in Africa were very valuable to plantation owners who were not familiar with the techniques used to get the most out of their crop. The same was true for indigo, which was harvested by slaves from the Caribbean, where indigo grew in abundance. In the North, which we will characterize as anything north of the Chesapeake Bay area, slaves were found both in cities and in the countryside. In cities, men were often used as manual labor, while women were often used as domestic servants. Nevertheless, the majority of slaves in the North worked in the countryside. There were never as many slaves in the North as in the South, but those who used slaves relied heavily on them. Despite the serious ethical issues surrounding slavery, colonists and others throughout the world accepted slavery because of its economic importance. While that is certainly no excuse, it's hard to deny that slavery allowed the colonies to grow to the point where they could achieve a level of economic independence from England. This will become more and more important as we edge closer to the American Revolution.